Valencia, Spain, November 2014. MotoGP has just handed every team on the grid the same black box. Same hardware, same software, same electronic control unit. Ducati, Yamaha, Honda, Suzuki, Aprilia, all of them. One spec ECU manufactured by Magneti Marelli. The pitch was straightforward. A level electronic playing field, reduced development costs in an end to the arms race where factory squads spent more on software than some entire racing series spent on everything. What happened instead is that somebody figured out how to cheat it before the ink was dry on the mandate, and MotoGP's own director of technology went on the record to explain exactly how. To understand the cheat, you need to understand what the ECU controls. A modern MotoGP motorcycle is not operated by the rider alone. The rider provides inputs. The ECU decides how much of those inputs to honor. When a rider opens the throttle exiting a corner, the ECU simultaneously checks lean angle, wheel speed differential, acceleration rate, and throttle position. It calculates the maximum throttle the rear tire can handle without spinning. Then it delivers that amount, no more. Lean angle is the foundation of the entire traction control system. Corner harder, less grip available, less throttle permitted. Stand the bike up, more grip, more throttle allowed. The ECU runs this calculation hundreds of times per second through every corner of every lap. Change the lean angle input, and you change every downstream calculation that depends on it. That lean angle reading comes from the IMU, the inertial measurement unit, a sensor package that measures the bike's attitude in 3 dimensions simultaneously. In 2014, MotoGP mandated the spec ECU hardware. In 2016, they mandated the spec software running on it. The IMU stayed uncontrolled, proprietary. Each team sourced their own. Each team's sensor fed its numbers directly into the shared box that was supposed to make cheating impossible. Corrado Cecchinelli is MotoGP's director of technology. In a 2017 interview with Crash.net, he described the vulnerability in plain language. A team could modify the IMU signal, feed artificially reduced lean angle data to the spec ECU, make the bike think it was leaning at 62 degrees when it was actually at 70. The ECU would respond to the false input and permit more throttle than the regulations intended. More throttle through every corner, every lap of every season. He called it IMU doping. Listen, MotoGP's own director of technology, in a published interview, used the word doping to describe a vulnerability his own spec system could not detect or prevent. Here's what that means in practice. A MotoGP lab at a typical circuit has 14 to 16 corners. Each corner has a traction control intervention window where the ECU is actively managing throttle delivery. A team running a manipulated IMU gets a measurably larger throttle window in each of those phases. 10 additional meters of throttle per corner sounds small. Multiply it across 16 corners, 20 laps, and 18 rounds in a season. That is a championship, and nobody can detect it because the ECU data logs look completely clean. The ECU was working exactly as designed. The input it received was false. The output it produced was technically legal. From the moment the spec software arrived in 2016 to the moment the spec IMU was finally mandated in January 2019, the vulnerability was open. 3 full seasons, 3 years of uncontrolled sensor data feeding into a spec ECU that could not distinguish a legitimate lean angle reading from a manipulated one. 3 seasons where factory teams with the best sensor engineers had a structural advantage that satellite operations could not match, could not buy, and could not detect by examining publicly available telemetry. To understand why this matters beyond the technical details, you need to understand what the spec ECU era was supposed to mean for the sport. Before 2014, the factory teams were operating in a software arms race that was making MotoGP a competition between software departments rather than riders and machines. Factory teams were spending more on software development than some entire racing series spent on everything combined. A satellite team running a customer bike was not just outgunned on horsepower, it was running a motorcycle whose electronics responded to the world differently. The spec ECU was supposed to fix that. It fixed the hardware problem. The IMU loophole meant it did not fix the underlying problem, it just moved it one level below where anyone was looking. In 2012, 2 years before the spec ECU existed, Marc Marquez raced in Moto2. A rival team filed a formal protest claiming Marquez ran a quick shifter with self-erasing software maps that deleted themselves from ECU memory after each run, nothing recoverable during inspection. The protest was thoroughly investigated. Marquez was cleared. No illegal software was found. What the investigation confirmed was that self-erasing racing ECU software was discussed as a functional concept in 2012, 3 years before the spec software mandate. By 2016, when factory teams had 3 full seasons of motivation and engineering budgets that exceed most defense spending, the capability question was not in doubt. In January 2020, Anthony West posted on social media with statements reported by VisorDown and GP1 claiming direct knowledge of systematic corruption inside MotoGP. He named Thomas Luthi specifically. West had been banned from racing for his own doping violations twice. His personal credibility was compromised. MotoGP dismissed his claims. No investigation was announced. West later publicly apologized and retracted his statements. The spec IMU arrived in 2019. No historical violations were announced, no retrospective penalties applied, no public accounting of whether the 3-year uncontrolled window produced results that deserved scrutiny. Before the spec ECU, factory teams spent their development budgets on proprietary software. After it, those same engineers pivoted to a problem the new rules had not anticipated. The institutional knowledge did not disappear, it changed direction. The teams that understood that had 3 seasons of advantage before the rulebook caught up. In the 2016, 2017, and 2018 MotoGP championship tables, the tabulations do not have asterisks. The podium finishes do not have footnotes. The riders who lost those races cannot point to a specific margin and say that margin came from a manipulated IMU. What they can point to is a 3-year window during which a structural technical advantage existed, was publicly identified by the governing body's own technology director, and was permitted to continue. MotoGP identified the vulnerability. Cesanelli put it on record. They waited 3 years to close the door. Cesanelli called it doping. The championship results from those 3 seasons are permanent. MotoGP calls that moving forward.